your brain is not just representing the patterns of sensory information in the world and in the body right now. It's also predicting what's going to come next. It's actually already starting to prepare what you're going to do next, what you're going to see next, what you're going to hear next, and so on. So we're really talking about milliseconds from now. And I would tell you that there's really good evidence, for example, with kids who have test anxiety, that you can completely eradicate that test anxiety by teaching them to construct different experiences out of that arousal, to make sense of those arousing affective feelings in a very, very different way.
Hi, this is Danae. I'm the founder of Simple Families. Simple Families is an online community for parents who are seeking a simpler, more intentional life. In this show, we focus on minimalism with kids, positive parenting, family wellness, and decreasing the mental load. My perspectives are based in my firsthand experience raising kids, but also rooted in my PhD in child development. So you're going to hear conversations that are based in research, but more importantly, real life. Thanks for joining us. Hi there. Thanks so much for tuning in. We are starting the new year off with a conversation with Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. Dr. Barrett is among the top 1% of most cited scientists in the world, primarily for her revolutionary research in psychology and neuroscience. In addition to being a scientist and a researcher, she's also dedicated to making her work and the work of others more accessible through conversations like this. Today, she's sharing some of her insights from her best-selling books, How Emotions Are Made and The Secret Life of the Brain, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. Dr. Barrett also has a popular TED Talk that has had more than 6.5 million views. I'll put the links to all of that in the show notes at simplefamilies.com/episode 335. It's an honor to be able to talk to Dr. Barrett today about emotions, how they're made, how to understand them, and also a little bit about what she calls the body budget, which I think you're really going to enjoy. Without further ado, here's our chat. Hi, Lisa. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for chatting with me today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on your podcast.
Absolutely. So you research emotions. Tell us a little bit about how you got started in this.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I was a graduate student. I was studying something else entirely, actually. But I had to measure people's emotional responses. And I noticed that the measures weren't performing the way that they were supposed to be performing, according to what I had learned in textbooks and, as an undergraduate and so on. And so mainly I was asking people how they feel. And people were telling me, even though they were using words like angry, sad, happy, afraid, and so on, really, when you look at the data, what they were saying is they felt happy, they felt pleasant or unpleasant. And they were using words like angry, sad, afraid as synonyms for I feel bad. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, well, I guess I'll just have to learn to measure emotions objectively by measuring people's facial expressions or their physiological changes. Because I had learned that there were these universal signatures, for different emotional states, and that they were present at birth, they were innate, and so on. And so I thought it was going to be really straightforward. I thought, well, it'll just take me a couple of months. I'll figure out how to do this, and then I'll kind of get back to my day job, which was studying the self and self, what your ideas are about yourself, self-esteem, your image of yourself relative to what your parents want for you, relative to your ideals for yourself, that kind of thing. Anyways, long story short, once I dug into the literature, I realized it's a myth, actually, that, that there are these universal expressions on the face, and that there are these universal, markers in the body. And that led me to retrain as a neuroscientist. And here we are, 30 years later, and I still haven't really solved the problem, but that's okay, because no one's really solved the mystery of emotions. But I think I have a much better handle on it So that it began really with my, the hubris of a young scientist, maybe.
Yeah. And you're a mother, right?
I am a mother.
Yeah, so I think, I think about how hard it is to understand adult emotions. What was that experience like, understanding emotions from a scientific perspective, and then also, raising a child with less predictable emotions?
I wouldn't say that children have less predictable emotions,
Okay.
actually. I think what I would say is that um, that children, we talk about unpredictable emotions. Today, when I was driving to work in the car, this Kermit the Frog came on the radio singing Rainbow Connection, and I had to pull over because I was crying so hard listening to this song because it reminded me of my daughter when she was a very little girl.
Yeah.
And this is something no one warns you about when you're uh, having children, that your little child will grow up to be a big person who you will adore, but you'll also really miss that little person who is lost to you, right?
Yeah.
And my daughter doesn't remember, she's now 24, she doesn't remember herself as that tiny little girl, but I adored that tiny little girl too, in a different way than I adore my big 24-year-old woman daughter. But so I mean, what I would say is that emotions in general are not always, the brain doesn't always make itself aware of constructing them, so they feel sometimes unpredictable. But in young children, there's a question of whether their brains are equipped to construct emotions, or whether we're instructing their brains, giving their brains learning cues for how to do that. So when you see your infant cry, you hear an infant cry, and you see that infant crying in a context, in a spatial context, in a temporal context, your brain is automatically using all that information to make an inference about what the cry means. But an infant's cry doesn't tell you anything about whether it's hungry, or whether that baby is hungry or tired or cold or just needs a cuddle. And, that's something that we infer from the context. And there's no evidence that emotions are innate. There's much more evidence that emotions are learned, and they're learned the way that infants learn to do almost everything, which is from the environment, from them exploring and interacting with the environment.
Mm. Interesting. I remember when my first child was a young infant, there was something, I don't know if it was on Dr. Phil or Oprah or somewhere, where someone had decided they had unpacked the language of infancy, and like Nana meant I want a bottle. And they had kind of like labeled all of these, really, they labeled the emotions and the cries.
Well, it may have meant that it may have meant that for that child. Like my
Yeah.
daughter made up certain sets of sounds. She had learned that certain sets of sounds that we responded to, and so she used those sounds as words. So, for example, when she was very small, she would say "did-la" to mean "what's that," and "mook" to mean milk.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was using sets of sounds as words, as references. And infants learn to do this really, really at a very, very young age. It's actually really miraculous. So if you explicitly label, we always explicitly label things for our children, right? Like that's a truck, that's a dog, right? That's sadness. Oh, honey, don't be sad. Oh, honey, you're happy. Oh, don't be angry. We're just using words that we know in everyday speech in a way that is predictable. And at about 3 months of age, children start to learn. They don't know words, but they can tell when a set of sounds is predictably related to some other set of cues. So I'll give you an example. For example, if I show a 3-month-old, a pen, and I say, "Sweetie, this is a blick," and then I drop the pen and it maybe makes a squeaking noise. And then I pick up some other object which looks different and it feels different, and I say, like maybe my phone, and I say, "Look, sweetie, this is a blick," and I drop the blick and it makes a squeaky noise. Then I can pick up a third item that doesn't look like either of the first two, and I say, "Look, sweetie, this is a blick." And the baby is now expecting that when I drop that item, it's going to make a squeaky noise. Like a 3-month-old can do something like that. So what the child is doing is it's learning patterns of signals And words are just a collection of signals, of sounds. And that's the beginning of language development.
Yeah. And is there value in labeling all of these different emotions for
Absolutely.
our children?
What I just told you is the example that I just gave you is a word being an invitation to construct an abstract concept, where the exemplars, the pen, the phone, whatever set of keys, they look different. If you touch them, they feel different. But they all have the same function. The function, which is to squeak in this example, supersedes the similarity in function, supersedes their differences in other in the visual and haptic touch domains. That's basically what an abstract concept is. So children as young as 3 months old can use sounds, particularly, and by 4 months old, this is work by Sandy Waxman at Northwestern University. By 4 months old, they are particularly attuned to the words that humans speak, the sounds that other humans make. They're like invitations to learn abstract concepts. So yeah, using words, labeling things is one of the ways that babies start to learn which things in the environment are important and predictable and reliable, and which things they can ignore as noise.
Mm-hmm. But what about specifically labeling emotions?
Well, when you label an infant's emotions, keep in mind that in order for a brain to make emotions, it has to have emotion knowledge, and babies are not born with emotion knowledge. And I need to make a distinction here between simple feelings of feeling pleasant and unpleasant, feeling pleasure, feeling pain, feeling worked up, feeling, fussy, or feeling calm. Those are simple feelings that babies are born feeling. They have the capacity to feel that. And in fact, as far as we know, most vertebrates actually can feel those feelings, and maybe even some invertebrates. So those feelings come from the brain's regulation of the body. Your brain's main job is regulating the systems of your body, and your body's always sending sense data back to your brain, and you experience that as these simple feelings, what you might call mood. A scientist like me might call them affect. Those are properties of consciousness. They're with you all the time. Infants feel those things. They feel pleasure and pain. But an emotion is an instance where the brain is linking those sensory changes in the body with sensory changes in the world in order to plan action. And in order to do that, the baby has to have emotion knowledge. And babies are not born with emotion knowledge. They learn it. Babies are born with, not miniature adult brains. They're born with brains that have to finish wiring themselves, and they wire themselves to the world that they inhabit. So they wire themselves specifically to the infant's body and to the infant's world, including the world that is populated by other people. So when you use emotion words with your infant, you are teaching that infant, you're inviting that infant to learn those emotion concepts and use those concepts in the future to create other instances of emotion later on.
Yeah. One of the things a lot of things have struck me in your work, but one thing especially was this idea that we can't really reliably read other people's emotions.
Well, you're not reading other people's
Okay.
emotions. It's not that you do it unreliably. You're not reading. I mean, emotions are not, facial movements, vocal sounds, body postures they don't have inherent emotional meaning, and they're not like words that can be read on a page.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at someone's face, or you listen to their voice, what you're doing is you're actually taking in an entire ensemble of signals, and your brain is making an inference about the emotional meaning of those signals. So it's actually a serious problem that infants have to deal with. Actually, all of us do, but it's harder for infants, because think about, for example, all the things that you might do or how you might sound when you're happy. When you're happy, you might smile, you might laugh, but you might also groan, you might cry, you might, slam your fist on the table in enthusiasm. There are a lot of things that you can do when you're happy, and your vocalizations might change. And somehow a baby has to learn that all of those different instances, which sound different and look different, that they all have the same meaning. It's just like that example with, this is a blick, right? That all these different objects have the same function. They make a squeak when you drop them. The way the baby learns that is because the word is paired with each instance. And so it's exactly the same. How does a baby learn what happiness is when what they're observing is so variable? Or when other people are labeling their movements or their sounds, the baby's movements or the baby's sounds, as happiness, even though those sounds are highly variable and the movements are highly variable. How does the baby learn? Well, the baby learns with the word. And the more words that the baby learns, the broader the vocabulary that the baby has, the better equipped the baby is to make emotions that are highly tailored to the situation in the future.
Yeah. So right now we are in the process of hiring a new au pair. And hiring an au pair is kind of like online dating. You have a profile and pictures and you're reading about this person, and then you make a connection and you do a video chat. And I've been thinking about your work as I'm interviewing, because I find, I'm interviewing all these strangers who, I've never seen their facial expressions before. And I find that I'm desperately trying to make predictions about them, right? Do they like me? Are they interested in coming to our family? What is it going to be like to live with this person? Are they reserved? Are they outgoing? I'm really grasping for straws, trying to watch their facial movements and hear their intonation, but I have no idea, right? So I'm using my own experiences to make those predictions. It's not about them; it's about me.
Absolutely. I mean, your inferences about other people's emotions are as much about them as they are about you, or they're as much about your past experience as they are about what that person is doing. So the first thing I'll say is, you just spoke a set of words that you made an inference that I would say most people that I talk to make, and that is that facial movements are facial expressions. I mean, sometimes, your face is moving all the time. Like right now, you and I are looking at each other and you just curled, one side of your lip just curled and the other one didn't. Was that an expression, or was that just a movement? Right. So humans move their faces all the time. Only sometimes are those movements expressions. So, we assume that every movement is an expression, so much so that we think those are synonyms. But actually, movements are movements, and sometimes they're expressions. So the first task that we have is to try to figure out, make an inference about, like, is that movement meaningful? Right. So I might grimace or scowl when I'm angry, but I might scowl when someone tells a bad joke, and I might scowl if I have gas. So a scowl is not always, in fact, it's rarely an expression of anger, it turns out. It's only about 35% of the time do people in the West scowl when they're angry, and it's even less in other cultures. So I guess my point is that's my first point, that there are already inferences that we're making about what movements are meaningful. But I have many students from around the world, and my lab has been to Namibia and Tanzania. We've studied hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. We've studied the Himba in Namibia. We've studied people all around the world. And when you are interacting with people whose past experiences are very different from yours, and whose life experiences, that the world that they live in is just really different from yours, there's a certain degree of mind blindness that you have, meaning it's because you don't share the same experiences, it's hard to make guesses, it's hard to make inferences, because your knowledge doesn't necessarily translate into good predictions about what their movements mean. And I think it's important to remember that, and to be humble about, no matter how confident you are in your ability to so-called read people, your brain is really just guessing. And that's even true, like you and I probably have much more in common than, when I'm talking to somebody from Japan, say, one of my male graduate students or postdocs from Japan. But it's easy, the familiarity that I might have with you because, we were born on the same continent and we speak the same language and we're both women and so on. It's easy to think that it's easy to feel confident about my ability to guess, but I'm still guessing, right? And I think that it's important to always remember that, even when you're interacting with people who are even more similar to you, actually.
We're going to pause for a 60-second word from today's sponsor. Here's something that you might have thought about. I know I have. Why does laundry detergent come in those massive plastic jugs? Nobody wants that. It's heavy and it's messy. That's why I was thrilled to try out Earth Breeze. Earth Breeze functions very much like a dryer sheet. That's what it looked like to me. You simply pull it out and drop it into any wash cycle, hot or cold. It couldn't be easier. No measuring, no mess. Just toss them in. And it's also safe for sensitive skin. I have loved how simple it is, how well it works. And even when I'm traveling, I can drop a few sheets into my suitcase, and it adds literally no weight to my bag. But you won't really know until you try it. If you don't like it, Earth Breeze will give you a full refund, and you don't even have to send it back. Now's the time to try Earth Breeze, because right now my listeners can subscribe and save 40%. Go to earthbreeze.com/simple to get started. That's earthbreeze.com/simple for 40% off. earthbreeze.com/simple. Thanks for supporting our sponsors. Back to our chat. I have a lot of listeners who are overwhelmed parents. Maybe most of my listeners are overwhelmed parents. I think in this year.
Does that ever stop?
Right. Yeah, it's hard to not be an overwhelmed parent. Those words have kind of been connected for some time. And I think the idea of a body budget really will resonate with a lot of people. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, sure. So, your brain's most important job from an evolutionary standpoint. Why do we have brains? It's easy to think that we have brains because they're rational. They allow us to be rational, or because they help us to see and feel things or whatever. But actually, brains evolved to regulate bodies. So right now, as you and I are talking, we both have a lot of drama going on inside our own bodies. In fact, as our listeners are listening to us talk, there's a lot of drama going on inside each and every one of them. And I would hazard the guess that most people are unaware of that drama. At least I hope they're unaware, because if they're actually can feel what's going on inside their bodies, something is seriously probably amiss, something seriously wrong. So most of the time we don't feel every, gush of chemicals and every, squirt of cortisol and every, we don't feel every single sensory change in our bodies. Instead, as I mentioned, we experience those as mood or these simple feelings. But your brain's most important job is regulating your body, and it's doing that every moment of your life. And the way to think about that regulation, or a good metaphor, the technical term is allostasis, which means that your brain is predictively regulating your body in an attempt to be metabolically efficient. But the analogy is a body budget. So you can think about your brain. It's a metaphor, really. And so it's simplifying a lot of complicated details. But the idea is that your brain is running a budget for your body. And it's not budgeting money. It's budgeting glucose and salt and oxygen and water and so on. And so you can think about making deposits into that body budget, like eating and sleeping. You can think about making withdrawals from that body budget. So when you drag yourself out of bed in the morning, when you exercise, when you learn something new, those are all expenditures, withdrawals from your body budget. You can think about making a little savings, like having a little savings. So it turns out that when you're around someone that you love or someone that you trust, certain things are less metabolically expensive than if you were doing them by yourself. And that's because we don't just make deposits and withdrawals into our own body budgets. We also metaphorically make deposits and withdrawals from other people's body budgets. That is, we are the caretakers of other people's nervous systems. And so other people can provide a savings for your body budget, and they can also be a tax. And for babies, little babies, right, their brains aren't fully formed yet. So they can't do body budgeting on their own. They can't survive on their own. In fact, much of what we're doing is managing their body budgets for them, and their attachment to us is very much rooted in our management of their body budgets. And over time, they learn, their brains become wired to manage their own body budgets in much the same way that we manage their body budgets for them.
So I want to rewind for a second. The idea that exercise and learning something new are expenditures from our budget, when I guess I'm thinking that those things enrich our lives. So help us understand what adds to and what takes away from the body budget.
Well, anything which requires glucose takes away from the budget. So you have to replenish what you spend. So I would think about exercise and learning something new as an investment. You're spending something now to get a return on that expenditure later. Okay. But you have to replenish what you spend. If you don't replenish what you spend, you start to run a deficit. And that has, you know, in the moment, a little deficit is, you'll feel it as unpleasantness, but it's not going to be a problem. But over the long run, you know, if you have little withdrawals that are not replenished, then your deficit grows. And when it grows to a certain point, your immune system will get involved, and then things get really expensive and you become sick.
So from an evolutionary standpoint, do we as parents lose sleep and take care of infants for sort of the exchange that they will refill our body budget through that relationship with them?
Well, that's a story.
Okay.
I don't know that we know the answer to that question, actually. So I'm suspicious of just so stories like that.
Okay.
I mean, it's important to understand that brains are like masters of deception, right? We're really just a bunch of brains trying to figure out how brains work. And our own experiences of the world, the experiences that our brains construct, are not a really good guide to actually how brains work. This is something neuroscientists, you know, we should be humble about, because it's like, so I would say the following. I exercise every day. I don't like it very much, but I do it because it keeps me healthy, and it makes me, it will keep me healthy in the future. So it's an investment that I'm making for a return that I get pretty immediately, actually, but also in the long term. You could use that same argument with parents and kids. I would say that managing somebody else's body budget definitely makes withdrawals on your own. But you also get benefit. There are deposits immediately that you get from having a little baby around. You know, we know this because we say things like that. Oh, it's a really good thing they're so cute, because otherwise, you know, how would we ever get through? Well, and there's something wonderful about, I don't know if you had this experience yet, but, you know, my daughter used to, when she was young, she would run everywhere. She would not walk. She would run everywhere, and always to me. Like, I would pick her up from school, and every day she would run, like just flat out run. And, you know, I would gather her up in my arms, and it didn't matter what kind of a day I was having, honestly, because for that 10 minutes, those were like sometimes the best 10 minutes of my whole day. And that was a major deposit in my body budget every day. I don't have to wait to be old and decrepit for her to, you know, return the investment. There are costs and rewards, investments and deposits and withdrawals on a daily basis. Now, what that has to do with the drive to have children and continue to take care of them, I think that's, you know, we could certainly make a story, but I don't really know the answer, honestly.
Yeah. So some people have a harder time seeing their future self and imagining and making those deposits for the future. Do people, and especially neurodivergent people, have a harder time seeing
I
themselves
think
into the
everybody,
future?
I think a lot, I don't think you have to be neurodivergent to
Yeah,
have a hard time. I think every climate change is like the perfect example of everybody having
right.
a
No,
really
it's
hard
true.
time. Yeah.
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 So when seeing, if you can see yourself in the future, do you usually have a more managed body budget? Is that a key part of managing your body budget, do you think?
So that's an interesting question. I would say when we talk about the brain predicting, what we usually mean by that is if we were to hold the time still right now, your brain is not just representing the patterns of sensory information in the world and in the body right now. It's also predicting what's going to come next. It's actually already starting to prepare what you're going to do next, what you're going to see next, what you're going to hear next, and so on. So we're really talking about milliseconds from now, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we had more time, I could give you lots of examples of how this works. Every sport that that involves a ball is based on these predictive transactions between the brain and the body. But the question of whether and the brain is predicting on multiple time scales. So not just a moment from now, but, a few minutes from now, or maybe, an hour or two from now. And then what you're asking me is about days or weeks or months or years from now. And I don't think we know the answer to that. I think I can say that a brain that predicts well in the present moment for the next moment or for the next few moments definitely is a brain that manages its body budget more efficiently, for sure.
Okay. I also heard you say that depression is a depleted body budget. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, depression is at its basis a metabolic problem. Either the brain believes there's a metabolic problem in the body, or there actually is a metabolic problem in the body. But basically, when your body budget starts to run a deficit, you feel fatigued and you feel distressed. And when you're running a deficit in your actual budget, like your bank account, what do you do? You stop spending usually, or you slow your spending. So what does it mean for a brain to slow its spending? It means you move less. It means you learn less. You're less likely to take in new information from the world that you didn't predict, which is what learning is. You sort of stick with what you know. And depression is a bankrupt body budget. The symptoms are very much associated with, compromised metabolic function. Like I said, either there really is a metabolic problem, maybe a mitochondrial problem, maybe you've been sick. There's this finding that people who have metabolic illnesses like heart disease or diabetes have a very, very high rate of depression, like over 70%, which almost, statistically means that almost they're the same disease. But doctors ask questions, well, what is it about diabetes that would lead someone to be depressed? Or what would it be? Why is it that heart disease causes depression? And the answer is it's not a causal relationship. All these diseases stem from a common problem, which is a problem in metabolism. And anytime your immune system is very, very expensive, metabolically expensive. So anytime your immune system gets involved, things become much more expensive. A lot of the symptoms we see in long COVID, for example, are probably the effect of metabolic consequences, longer term metabolic consequences of having that virus in your body and your body attempting to fight it off. But of course, that's not how people think about it. But fundamentally, many of the things that we think of as separate diseases actually have a common metabolic basis. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So I am a therapist and I see a lot of kids in my office with challenges regulating their emotions. How do you think that connects to their body budgets?
Well, let's take neurodivergent kids for a second as because this is a set of findings that I think is really, really instructive. So most children, neurotypical brains, as they wire themselves to their environment. So part of what you're doing when you're cultivating or curating a child's environment is you're wiring its brain. If you let your child watch TV, if you don't let your child watch TV, if you let your child eat goldfish, if you don't let your child eat goldfish, all of these things, they're all small things, but they all have an impact. But some brains predict better than others. Some brains learn faster than others. And some brains aren't wired to predict particularly well. So if your brain doesn't predict well, you're constantly reacting to things. And reaction is much more expensive metabolically than prediction. To predict and correct is even less expensive than react. Very expensive. So neurodivergent brains are often more metabolically expensive brains. And that's going to, just by virtue of the fact that there's greater expense there, it's going to make it harder for those little brains to regulate those little bodies. Mm-hmm. But in addition, with certain types of neurodivergent structures, there's also less social cueing to pull in body budgeting support from other people, like from parents and caregivers. So neurotypical brains will ask for juice, or they'll ask for water, or they'll they might nag you, they might whine, but they're asking for something that they need. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't always happen. They might get cranky, or they might, right? But there's some set of signals, and then you have to figure out what those signals mean. But with some kids, particularly on the spectrum, you can't tell from their movements. It looks placid on the surface. And then all of a sudden, the smallest change will provoke like a major tantrum. And, we're left being very puzzled by this. And we make up a story about, overactive emotion circuits and underactive control circuits. But actually, if you were to slap a heart monitor on those kids, their heart is racing at like 150, 160 beats a minute, even though they look completely placid.
So before the reaction, you're saying that they're already elevated.
They're already elevated. It's just that teachers and parents can't tell because the cues that they're used to making inferences about aren't there. So not only do these kids have their brains have difficulty predicting, and not only do they not socially cue for help in regulation,
speak up for what they need,
they also don't have many of the same movements and vocalizations that neurotypical brains have, that parents or caregivers might notice to intervene before the tantrum comes. And so in that case, what's happening in those tantrums is not that those kids are overly emotional, and it's not that they're acting out, it's that their brain is attempting to reset their nervous system. Like they're trying to calm down, and the way to calm down is to explode, and then and then the nervous system is calm again. And if you think about it that way, which there's evidence from Matthew Goodman's work actually here at Northeastern, it's really remarkable that you can look at these kids and they just look so placid. And then you look at what's happening to their physiology, and they are anything but placid inside. You have tremendous empathy for these kids, right? Because their brains are using what they have, and they can't avail themselves as easily from the body budgeting support that we take for granted. When you put your child to sleep, when you feed your child, when you give your child a hug, do you think to yourself, oh, I'm engaging in body budgeting support? No, you don't. But that is actually what you're doing all the time. If your child is securely attached to you, that's because you provide consistent and reliable body budgeting support to that kid.
Yeah. I have a kid that experiences auditory overwhelm. And it's knowing that has been such a powerful part of my parenting because, I have a lot of empathy around that. And I have no idea what it's like to be in that brain, but I can only imagine the tax on his body budget every day, showing up in this noisy world and how exhausting and taxing that must be.
Absolutely.
So just knowing that much, I think, when we can understand those pieces of our kids, how it can help us to figure out how to help them fill their body budgets back up or give opportunities for that.
Absolutely. And I think, another thing which I think is in line with that is, again, with kids who are neurodivergent, there was this stereotype really that kids on the spectrum, for example, didn't want social interaction, didn't care about other people. And maybe that's true in certain cases, but actually many of them experience, what's described as anxiety, as social anxiety. I might describe it a little differently in the following way. When your brain can't predict what's going to happen next in the body or in the world, it attempts to try to learn what we call prediction error. That is the stuff that the brain didn't predict. It's attempting to learn. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, your brain will secrete certain chemicals and your body will secrete certain chemicals that will raise your heart rate, will make your palms sweaty, basically will increase your level of arousal, which goes with learning. And we experience that most often as anxiety. We create anxiety out of that when really what it is, it's arousal in the service of reducing uncertainty. So imagine you're a little brain who isn't body budgeting very well, can't predict very well, can't take advantage of other people's efforts to give body budgeting support. You're probably walking around anxious all the time, actually. But of course, there's no way that you express it in ways that other people could make inferences about. And to make matters worse, you look disinterested. But again, it's not like we're reading that disinterest, we're inferring it. And we're inferring it from the signals that we always use, which are vocalizations. And right. So I think that it gives you, I think, much more empathy and also much more curiosity about what someone is experiencing, which may be really different from your inferences about. And the thing that's important for parents to understand is that when you start offering children words, you're inviting them to have that, to make that experience, right? So part of the reason why we have so many kids who are anxious right now is because they live in worlds that are very unpredictable. We live in a society where food and shelter are not human rights. There's a lot of unpredictability that kids have to deal with every day. Some of it is normal, the normal part of life, right? But there's more than that. And so there's a lot of arousal, and the go-to explanation is anxiety. But you can actually teach people and children that arousal sometimes is just uncertainty, and it doesn't have to be anxiety. It can be curiosity. It can be determination. It can be many, many different things. And that may sound crazy to you, but I would invite you to try it. And I would tell you that there's really good evidence, for example, with kids who have test anxiety, that you can completely eradicate that test anxiety by teaching them to construct different experiences out of that arousal, to make sense of those arousing affective feelings in a very, very different way.
So would that be something like changing self-talk, right before a test, instead of saying, I'm so nervous, changing the self-talk to say, I'm so excited. I'm so thrilled to be taking this test.
Yeah, I'm determined. And actually the research evidence shows kids, for example, for young adults who were in high school or college age, test anxiety can lead people to not go to college, to drop out of college. That actually changes their future earning trajectory by hundreds of thousands of dollars throughout their lifetime. And if you train, you can train people to experience that arousal as determination. And when you do that, they experience determination. And it's like driving. At first, it's really deliberate. It's really hard. But then it's like a skill. You practice, 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 and then it gets automated and it feels like second nature. And that's exactly the way it works with making sense of your affective feelings. What you're doing is you're teaching yourself a skill. You're teaching yourself how to cultivate different experiences out of those feelings. And if you do it enough, if you practice it enough, it becomes pretty automatic. And then your behavior changes.
Yeah. So is that because the physiological sensations are the same, like between
Yes,
being nervous about a test and being excited about a test?
exactly.
Your body's
Exactly.
behaving in the same way, but your labeling in your brain is different.
It's not that you're labeling it, it's that you're creating other signal ensembles in your brain that give those physical signals different meaning.
Okay.
But that is what you're doing. And sometimes you don't want to create emotion out of it. So like, since the day my daughter was born, between like 4:30 and 6:30, she was, as a young baby, she was always fussy, fussy, fussy. And you can call it what you want, but it's actually always true. When she was a 5-year-old, she was fussy at that time. When she was a 9-year-old, she was fussy at that time.
Yeah.
Now we use different metaphors at different times, right?
The witching hour.
The witching hour, that's
Yeah.
exactly what we call it, the witching hour. When she was a little girl, we used to talk about the crabby fairy coming to visit. And the crabby fairy would come, and then what was she going to do in those moments when the crabby fairy was coming? And how was she going to keep the crabby fairy at bay or make the crabby fairy go away? When she was an adolescent, we used a different metaphor. But the point is that my daughter didn't grow up thinking of herself as a fussy, crabby person. She understood that there were just some physical things. First, there was like magical things happening, right? But then there were just some physical things happening. And now she knows, she's in her 20s. Now she knows that this is the time of day when her body budget's a little bit, she's running a bit of a deficit from the day, and she needs to be a little gentle with herself, right? And she should not make any serious decisions until she's had dinner.
I love that. Thank you so much, Lisa. This has been so great. I mean, I have a million other questions I could ask you, but I so appreciate your time. Let us know where we can find you online and your latest book.
Sure. So if you go to lisafeldmanbarrett.com, there are many, many podcasts and articles, some videotape lectures. They're all for free. But you could also find my two books there. One is How Emotions Are Made, which is a standard popular science book, which it covers much of this material. And then my newer book is called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. It's really a small little book of essays that are really, I wrote for people who don't think of themselves as interested in science. These essays kind of give you, you can read one in like 20 minutes. They give you a little couple of tidbits of neuroscience that you can like wow your friends at, when you over drinks or at a dinner party. But also these tidbits invite you to think about what it means to have a brain like the kind of brain that we have. Like, what does it mean for human nature, and what does it mean for the kind of human that you would like to be? It's not a book that tells you how to be. It more invites you to think about those questions from a neuroscientific point of view.
Yeah, it's amazing the impact of learning a little bit about the brain, how powerful that can be for parents and for kids to even learn about their own brain. And they can really, even at a young age, can really understand some basic stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you that I originally wrote How Emotions Are Made because my daughter, like many adolescents when she was an adolescent, became clinically depressed. And part of how I came to the understanding of what the brain was doing, and actually I shifted my entire research program was to try to figure out how to help her. And she came up with her own concepts, her own metaphors for understanding body budgeting that really helped her cope with what she was experiencing when she was an adolescent.
Oh, I love that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And I hope to have you back soon.
I would love that.
Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Lisa, otherwise known as Dr. Barrett. If you want to find links to the things that we talked about today, go to simplefamilies.com/episode 335. As always, thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you're here.